In the courtroom, tensions were already high. But when Judge Amy Coney Barrett laughed at Pam Bondi's remarks, no one expected what would happen next. Bondi, known for her quick wit and sharp comebacks, wasn't about to let Barrett's mockery slide. What happened next shocked everyone in the room, especially Judge Barrett, who found herself facing an emotional moment that no one could have predicted. What started as a lighthearted laugh quickly escalated into a confrontation that left the judge in tears. Make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on more incredible courtroom stories, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General, stood at the podium facing off against the ever-composed Judge Amy Coney Barrett. The case was complex, with high stakes and political undertones, but it was clear that neither woman was willing to back down. Judge Barrett, known for her calm demeanor and sharp intellect, had been quietly listening to Bondi's arguments. But, as Bondi made a particularly pointed statement about legal precedent, Barrett couldn't help but let out a small, mocking laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to send a ripple through the room. Bondi paused for a moment, taking in the sound. It wasn't just any laugh. It was dismissive, condescending, as if Barrett was undermining her. The audience shifted uncomfortably. What was meant to be a professional exchange had suddenly become personal. A tight smile curled on Bondi's lips. She had been in this game for too long to be rattled by a laugh. If anything, it fueled her determination. She wasn't here to play by Barrett's rules. She had her own. "Judge Barrett," Bondi began, her voice cool but steely, "I understand that my arguments may not be to your liking, but I'd appreciate it if we could keep this professional. I'm here to represent the law, not entertain you." Barrett, still with a slight smile on her face, glanced down at her papers. "Oh, of course, Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind." Bondi's eyes narrowed. She wasn't going to let this go. "I'm not here for a joke, Your Honor. I'm here to make sure justice is served, and that starts with respecting the process, not laughing at those trying to uphold it." The room went silent. It was clear that Bondi wasn't backing down, but no one expected what would come next. Judge Barrett's expression faltered. For a moment she looked almost embarrassed, but she quickly masked it, her professionalism slipping back into place. Still, there was a hint of something in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that no one had seen before. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, and it only escalated as Bondi stood her ground. The subtle challenge in her voice wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Judge Barrett. The judge, her smile now replaced with a thin line of irritation, straightened in her chair. She had expected Bondi to back down after the laugh, but Bondi wasn't intimidated. She was unshaken, her eyes locked with Barrett's in a silent challenge that echoed louder than any words. Barrett cleared her throat, her demeanor still composed but now tinged with a flicker of defensiveness. "I think, Ms. Bondi, we can both agree that emotions have no place in this courtroom," she said, trying to regain control of the situation. Her voice was firm, yet there was an undercurrent of something else, something that sounded like unease. Bondi tilted her head slightly, a spark of defiance in her gaze. "I'm not the one laughing, Judge. You are." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, it felt as though the entire room was holding its breath. Barrett's eyes flashed with something resembling frustration, but she quickly masked it with a cold stare. She wasn't about to let Bondi get the better of her, not in front of the room full of onlookers, not after her years of experience on the bench. "Let's focus on the matter at hand, Ms. Bondi," Barrett said, her voice steely now, as though she were trying to regain control of the room. "We're here to discuss the law, not personal attacks," but Bondi wasn't about to let the judge off that easily. "I'm not attacking you, Your Honor. I'm holding you accountable." The sharpness in her tone was unmistakable. She knew how to push Barrett's buttons, and she wasn't afraid to do it. "If you're going to mock my arguments, Then don't expect me to sit here and let it slide. The audience shifted uneasily. Some watched with rapt attention, while others exchanged glances, sensing that things were quickly moving into dangerous territory. This wasn't just a legal debate anymore, it had turned into something personal. And that was exactly what Bondi had intended. She wasn't just fighting a case, she was fighting for respect. Judge Barrett, despite her best efforts to remain composed, seemed to falter for a second. Her lips tightened, her gaze narrowing as Bondi's words sank in. There was a flicker of recognition in Barrett's eyes, something that suggested she wasn't just dealing with an attorney. She was dealing with someone who was willing to confront her, not just legally, but emotionally. Bondi wasn't afraid to call her out, to challenge her authority. Barrett quickly looked away, trying to regain her composure, but the damage had already been done. She had laughed at Bondi. She had underestimated her. And now, the tables had turned. What was supposed to be a simple courtroom exchange had evolved into something far more intense. Judge Barrett could feel the weight of Bondi's challenge hanging over her. And for the first time in the proceedings, she wasn't sure if she could control the situation. The judge took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. But Bondi wasn't finished. She knew she had struck a nerve and she wasn't about to let up. The room grew quieter as the standoff between Bondi and Barrett continued. The air, once thick with legal jargon and professional formality, now crackled with an intensity that was hard to ignore. Bondi could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, every movement, every word, carrying weight. But she didn't flinch. She wasn't here to win the crowd's approval. She was here to make a point. Judge Barrett, however, wasn't as composed as she wanted everyone to believe. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the desk, betraying the quiet tension building inside her. For a brief moment, she was no longer the unshakable figure behind the bench. She was a human being, vulnerable to the sting of Bondi's words. "Judge Barrett," Bondi continued, her voice low and steady, but laced with a hint of finality. "You have the power to influence outcomes, to determine the fate of many. But the way you treat people, your fellow professionals, matters. You may think a laugh in the face of an argument is just a small thing, but it's not. It's a sign of disrespect." Barrett's eyes flickered as the weight of Bondi's words hit her. There was no denying it. Bondi was calling her out, not just on her legal judgment, but on her very character. The laugh, once a harmless expression, now seemed to echo in the room, loud and unforgiving. "I don't take kindly to accusations of disrespect, Ms. Bondi," Barrett replied, her voice tight. She was trying to regain control, trying to assert her authority in the face of this challenge. But something in her tone, something small, betrayed her uncertainty. Bondi stepped closer to the podium, leaning forward just enough to make sure everyone could hear her next words. "Respect isn't something you can demand, Judge. It's something you earn." There was a pause, a beat, and then something unexpected happened. Judge Barrett's stern expression softened just slightly, barely noticeable, but there. For the first time, the laughter that had started this whole exchange seemed to lose its power. Barrett wasn't in control anymore. Bondi had turned the tables on her not by force, but by words. The judge cleared her throat, but her composure was starting to crack. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she knew that something was slipping through her fingers. Her authority, her reputation. Was it possible that it was eroding in front of the courtroom? Bondi's words hung in the air, refusing to dissipate. "You can laugh, Judge, but if you don't respect the people who come before you, you'll find that respect will be the first thing to leave you when you need it most." For a moment the courtroom seemed frozen in time. No one spoke, no one moved. Barrett's gaze lowered as if to collect her thoughts, but the weight of the moment was impossible to ignore. The words Bondi had spoken didn't just echo in her mind, they lingered in the room, in the very air that surrounded them. Judge Barrett, trying her best to maintain her composure, glanced around the courtroom. The audience, the attorneys, even the bailiffs, All seemed to be waiting for her next move. What would she do now? Would she admit her mistake, or would she double down? Could she regain control of the situation after the moment of vulnerability Bondi had exposed? Barrett's lips parted, but it was clear she was struggling to find the right words. This wasn't just about a legal argument anymore. It was about something far deeper. How power, respect, and accountability played out not just in courtrooms, but in every aspect of life. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Barrett's face remained taut, her eyes locked on Bondi. She was still trying to process what had just unfolded. How had a simple laugh turned into this? She had laughed off the challenge, but Bondi's response had pierced through the facade of judicial authority that Barrett had worked so hard to maintain. The courtroom had shifted. What was once a battleground for legal arguments had transformed into something more personal. Bondi wasn't done. She could see the cracks forming in Barrett's stoic exterior, and she wasn't about to let this moment pass by. The judge had shown her vulnerability, and Bondi intended to make sure it counted. She wasn't attacking the judge's intelligence, but she was making it clear that the court was not immune to the consequences of disrespect. "Judge," Bondi said, her voice softer now, but the sting of her words still carried. "I know that you're a person of influence, but it's important to remember, every action has consequences. You may laugh today, but that laughter can be a weapon. It can hurt, and it can erode trust, especially when you're in a position of power." Barrett's hand clenched around the papers in front of her. She had underestimated Bondi, and she knew it. There was no escaping it now. What had started as a lighthearted moment, an attempt to undermine Bondi's position, had turned into an emotional reckoning for the judge. The room was holding its breath. Even those who had initially sided with the judge were now watching with bated breath, sensing that the power dynamic was shifting. Barrett had spent years establishing herself as a no-nonsense authority figure, but now she was on the defensive. Bondi had exposed the cracks, and the audience could see the struggle in Barrett's eyes. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Barrett spoke, but her voice was different now. There was a tremor in it, a hint of something raw beneath the surface. "Ms. Bondi," she began, her words slow, deliberate. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I underestimated the weight of my actions." Bondi was taken aback, not by the words themselves, but by the vulnerability that Barrett had just shown. This wasn't the cold, detached judge she had expected to face in this courtroom. This was a person, a human being, admitting that she had made a mistake. The room fell into a stunned silence. Was Barrett about to apologize? Would she finally admit that her laugh had been a mistake? But before anyone could respond, Barrett continued, her voice still strained. "But you must understand, Ms. Bondi, that we cannot allow emotions to cloud our judgment. Not here. Not in this room." She straightened in her chair, a flash of determination flickering behind her eyes. "I may have laughed, but I will not let this trial be determined by petty personal drama." The words were firm, but the emotion that had briefly cracked her exterior was still present. Barrett had tried to regain control, but the damage had been done. The courtroom was no longer the same. She had been forced to confront something deeper, something she hadn't expected to encounter in this trial. She had underestimated the power of a well-placed response. Bondi, sensing the shift, held Barrett's gaze for a moment longer, almost as if to ensure that the judge truly understood the weight of her own words. She had accomplished what she came here to do. She had not only held her own against a formidable opponent, but she had forced that opponent to reconsider her own position. No longer just a courtroom exchange, this moment had become a symbol of something larger, the importance of respect, even in the most high-stakes situations. In the end, Bondi had shown Barrett and the entire room that sometimes the strongest arguments aren't made in legal jargon, but in raw honesty. The final moments of the trial were upon them. The air in the courtroom had shifted from tension to something else, something more reflective. Judge Barrett had regained some of her composure, but the reverberations of the previous exchange still hung in the room like a faint echo, an unspoken reminder of the vulnerability she had shown. Bondi stood at the podium, her face calm but her eyes sharp. She knew the game had changed. What had started as a simple legal battle had evolved into something far more personal, and in some ways, far more significant. She had been relentless, but in a way that made the judge rethink her own actions and the weight they carried. This wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about principles, respect, accountability. Barrett's voice cut through the silence, now steady, but there was still a trace of something softer in her tone. "Ms. Bondi," she began, looking directly at the attorney, "you've made your point, and while I may not always agree with your methods, I understand the importance of your argument." For the first time that day, Barrett wasn't hiding behind her judicial authority. She wasn't trying to deflect or regain control with a cold, distant comment. She was admitting something that, in that moment, felt like a victory. Not just for Bondi, but for the entire room. Bondi allowed herself a brief nod, her expression unwavering. She had earned this moment, and it wasn't about gloating. It was about making sure that the truth had been heard. She had gotten the judge to listen, to truly understand the gravity of her actions. "As we move forward, Your Honor," Bondi said, her voice firm but respectful, "let's remember that the law is about more than just precedent. It's about fairness. It's about understanding that the people who stand before you deserve dignity, even in the heat of a trial." Barrett's lips pressed together, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked down at her desk, as if processing the weight of what Bondi had just said. The laughter, the dismissiveness, it was all too clear now. Barrett had let herself slip into a place she hadn't intended, but it was no longer about saving face. It was about acknowledging the humanity of those around her. The audience watched in hushed silence. This wasn't the usual courtroom drama. This wasn't a simple exchange of legal strategies. This was a moment of real human vulnerability, a confrontation that had turned into an unlikely lesson in humility. Finally, Judge Barrett took a deep breath, as though releasing the weight of the past few minutes. "You're right, Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice low but sincere. "I apologize for my behavior. I can see now that my actions did not reflect the professionalism this courtroom deserves." The room seemed to exhale collectively. It was a rare sight, especially in such a high-profile case. Judge Barrett, one of the most respected figures on the bench, had just admitted fault in a public and profound way. But rather than diminishing her, it had only made her seem more human, more real. Bondi, ever the professional, nodded once again. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. She had won not just the case, but the respect that came with it. She had stood her ground and, in doing so, had forced one of the most powerful figures in the room to reflect and change. As the trial continued, it became clear that the final moments of the day had left an indelible mark on everyone present. The lesson was simple, yet powerful. No one is beyond reproach, and sometimes the most important victories aren't won in courtrooms. They're won in the moments when people are willing to challenge their own assumptions and grow.